Welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. We're here to facilitate inspiring dialogues about the nature of consciousness across disciplines, communities, and practitioners, all with a holistic perspective.
From energy healing to somatic therapies, from neuroscience to meditation, we believe the most interesting things happen at the boundaries of disciplines.
I'm Christabel.
And I'm Keith.
Thanks for joining us today and enjoy the episode. So before connecting with Susan today, Keith and I wanted to take a few minutes just to talk about family constellations as a modality or a philosophy, as Bert Hellinger referred to it, and a little bit about founder Bert Hellinger's own story. So Hellinger was a German psychotherapist as well as previously a Catholic priest. He spent 16 years in South Africa, where he was a priest, a teacher, and a headmaster at a large school. And whilst there, he became deeply involved with the Zulu culture. He was fluent not only in the language, but he participated as well in many Zulu rituals and gained an appreciation for their worldview, which was influential, hugely influential to the family constellations modality as it later evolved.
He left the priesthood and became a psychotherapist, studying many different approaches that informed his ever-evolving methodology, which became known eventually as family constellations or systemic family constellation work. He disseminated this work primarily through workshops and published more than 90 books, many of which are documentations of those constellations.
So what exactly is a family constellation? So in a family constellation, a client is choosing from participants in the group that's gathered to do the healing work at random. And they're asking them to represent important family members in their system. For example, a mother, a father, siblings. And the client is then able to place these representatives or asked to place these representatives in spatial relationship to one another within the room. And if they're doing this online, it may happen slightly differently, but this is working within the room. So through this constellation, hidden and surprising family dynamics come to light. So information is shared and dynamics are explored depending on the client's agenda and information that comes to light that is previously unknown. So the process of setting up a family constellation is really helping bring clients into contact with information that was previously hidden to them. And it's quite a powerful process to watch that be revealed.
So Christabel just described the general setup for a constellation. Now you might be wondering, how does the representative experience this? So just imagine you've been chosen to be in a constellation as somebody's mother. You don't know the person whose constellation is being done, or at least not well. You certainly don't know their mother. You don't know the stories about their mother. And you might be amongst many representatives, mothers, fathers, siblings, grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens to representatives is they start to feel or take on the sensations and perceptions of the people they're representing. So this could be physical symptoms. This could be thoughts or emotions. Sometimes even people have memory of a representative's name. Keep in mind, they know nothing about these people. So what this suggests is that when choosing to be a representative, you're taking on the field of information connected to that family system or group soul, as Hellinger would call it. What is so extraordinary is this representative model in which people are learning about through representing, which sometimes in other traditions you might call even being a surrogate, where you're actually holding the space of another person and you're actually having their feelings, having their thoughts, having their emotions. And this becomes the point of exchange for the constellation to begin to work itself out. And the therapist is the mediator.
So we wanted to share with you a quote from Love's Hidden Symmetry, What Makes Love Work in Relationships. This is a book co-authored by Bert Hellinger alongside several others. And this excerpt is by Hunter Beaumont. The orders of love are dynamic, systemic forces blowing and whirling in our families and intimate relationships. When we understand the systemic laws that allow love to unfold, we may be able to help suffering families and individuals to find solutions and to change their psychological habitats.
So this is a main concept here, the orders of love. This is kind of interesting and poetic and provocative concept that love is disordered or disarranged in these family systems when there are perturbations there, when the love isn't able to be expressed from generation to generation, isn't able to be accepted. And this is where the word systemic comes in. This is not working at an individual level, but rather at the group level or the family system level. This is a really important component. So much of the work of what Hellinger was doing can be seen as restoring these orders of love. And you might say to enable for love to flow from generation to successive generation.
So these orders of love become entangled. They become entangled based on family history, trauma, unresolved issues at the individual or even the group level, the systemic level. And this is very similar in our energy healing work to when we're looking at people working with blocks, inner child blocks, birth trauma, ancestral trauma healing. So it's really interesting to see those parallels and to consider this idea of entanglement between family members, entanglement between the system, disrupting these orders of love as you describe them.
We were lucky, both of us have studied a little bit of family constellation work with a couple of different teachers. We were drawn to it because of a certain power that it has. Certainly, one of the main things that family constellation work can do is it works very deeply into the emotional aspect of what's happening at the family level. And not only the emotions, but how these emotions are based in dynamics that are unseen or naked or invisible, as you just mentioned, is something, let's say, experienced by a grandparent or a great grandparent that you don't know of consciously might be revealed in a family constellation through a representative who didn't know who that grandparent was. That was the big shift in Hellinger's understanding of how to approach therapy, was not to work with an ideal, not to work with it's supposed to be this way or that, but rather to work with what's actually arising in the moment. What are people actually feeling that's coming through that group field, through those representatives in the constellation in that moment, to draw wisdom and to draw an understanding of what's happening. And so it's a fascinating approach to therapy. The therapist has to hold this phenomenological posture that they're going in not having any clue what is necessarily going to come out the other side.
I think one of the most rewarding aspects I've witnessed in family constellation work, or at least one of the most potent, is this relationship that it has to the idea of the soul, or the knowing field, it may be called. It's this idea that understanding comes through this participation in the knowing field, this recognition of this broader systemic perspective. The idea that the soul, as it were, extends beyond and guides the individual. Because we're working in family constellations at the soul level. And that's something that I know has been emphasized to both of us through teachers in this modality, that we're really doing soul level work. Observation in this field, work in this field, recognition, presence, and perception at this level of the field actively helps us to seek and find resolution. And these resolutions go far beyond what we could achieve with analytic thought. And they have effects far beyond what we could achieve with what might be deemed to be a well-considered action or a more mental orientation. We've certainly both witnessed incredibly powerful changes, not just to the person who is committed to doing the work, i.e. the person who's requested the constellation, but very often, more than not, family members who may or may not know that this work has even taken place, and find themselves sort of transformed or experiencing change in their own lives as a result of that.
Well, we just wanted to have a little preamble and an introduction for people who aren't familiar with this kind of work before speaking to Susan. So we're going to pass the baton and start the interview with Susan now. Hello, today we are with Susan Ulfelder, the director of the Hellinger Institute of DC, which is an educational institute founded to teach and promote the family constellations approach to individual and family issues developed by Bert Hellinger. A hands-on healer, she's both a graduate and former dean at the Barbara Brennan School of Healing. A traditional naturopath, she earned a Doctor of Integrative Medicine from Capital University of Integrative Medicine, where she was the chair of the Department of Energy and Spiritual Healing. It was while studying at CUIM where she became exposed to the work of Bert Hellinger and further expanded her awareness from an emphasis on the individual energy field to the family energy field. From that day on, she began to think and work systemically. Susan not only facilitates family constellations in a group format, but also facilitates individual constellations in private practice. She runs a facilitator training program focusing on the fundamentals of family constellations as well as an advanced program for continuing studies. Susan, it's very nice to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, for our listeners who aren't familiar with the work of family constellations, I'm wondering if we could take a moment and to define this. Sometimes it's called a philosophy or a system. How would you describe it or inform our listeners about what's behind this modality or philosophy?
I actually call it a healing modality that's based on the philosophy of Bert Hellinger, who was a former Jesuit priest who left the priesthood and started studying different forms of psychotherapy. And one day he happened to notice that someone's face had changed and she looked like an old lady. And he said, "Who is that? Who are you representing?" And from that day on, Family Constellations got started. So the healing modality is that we have a family energy field, not only your own individual, but you're a part of your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. And the issues that we have today are carried over issues that were never resolved from our family. So the modality started that Bert realized that you could have somebody represent a member of your family and look at it, but not only just look at it, but actually do something about it. And when you move someone from one place to another to change the order of things, it shifts the entire family system. You're basically changing it etherically, right? Or if you make a word, say a word, make a statement or a phrase or a sentence, that can shift the energy. So from a healer's perspective, this was an amazing revelation to me, only from working on individuals to realize, oh, wow, look at where we really come from, And working with this for a number of years, I realized that I could bring in some of the healing modalities that I do in my hands-on healing practice into the family constellations. So about the same time I became aware of family constellations, I also became aware of the work of Carolyn Mine, who is a chiropractor who wrote the book, Releasing Emotional Patterns with Essential Oils. And I started working with it first for myself because I had a lot of emotional baggage. And in my family, emotions were not honored, and so I stuffed a lot. And finding Carolyn's book was a huge healing for me. And eventually I started bringing it into my practice and working with my clients. And then because I was aware of the ancestral transgenerational families that we come from, I started bringing that into the constellation work as well as my healing practice. So I've been melding and synthesizing a lot of the healing modalities that I've been exposed to in my many years in practice.
Thanks, Suzanne, for sharing a little bit more there of your background. Certainly, I know we want to discuss some of this incredible background you have with the other accompanying modalities, such as the energy healing. I actually just wanted to touch in on something you raised there that is an important component of what Keith and I do as well. This concept of the healer doing their own work first and foremost, the practitioner's healing journey prior to looking to work with others, or at least alongside as well, continuing with that individual journey as we're looking to support others. And it just feels like to be a really worthwhile point to highlight there.
Absolutely. I don't think we as healers can take anyone where we haven't been ourselves. So we have to clean up our own issues in order to be able to hold the energy for someone else to process it, and what I have learned in doing groups is you have to do a whole lot more in order to hold the energy of everyone in the group. As part of my training program in the family constellation work, I encourage people to do their own work. They're going to end up doing their own family constellations in the training, and that's going to trigger everything else. And, there's so much out there that is available to in the alternative healing modalities that can assist people in their healing process, whether it's flower essences, essential oils, tuning forks, hands-on healing. And there's a myriad of different techniques that are out there these days. When I started in the early 80s, there was not that much available. But with the internet now, and with so many people getting awakened to consciousness and energy work and the auric field, etc., there's so much more out there.
I know we're going to wind up landing back in Hellinger's work and what you're doing currently with Family Constellations, but you have such a rich background in your training holistically, and are really curious about giving people a sense, what was that path for you in terms of winding up thinking systemically and working with families versus all these other steps and stages you went through beforehand?
Well, I started out as a dental hygienist. So my area of focus was the teeth, the mouth. And I became aware that some of my patients' bleeding stopped. Their bleeding gums stopped once they started taking vitamin C. So then I started nutrition and came very close to a PhD. I just never wrote the thesis. From there, as a dental hygienist studying nutrition, I left dental hygiene when I met a chiropractor who started doing what I thought at that time was hocus pocus on me, muscle testing. And, what are you doing? And you're telling me this stuff. And at the end of the session, he said to me, "Are there any decisions you haven't made lately?" And boy, was I offended. I always make my decisions. I'm really, that sat with me for a while. And that's when I decided I needed to leave dental hygiene. So I left there in 79 and studied Touch for Health, which you could not, there's no license to do Touch for Health. So I decided to study massage, but there was no massage schools in Maryland. So I took it in a woman's basement, realized that the Frimmer technique of massage was not the way I wanted to go, but that teacher taught polarity therapy. So I took a 2-year training with her. Everything's organic, it just flows. So I studied with her. I opened my polarity practice on April 1st, 1985, April Fool's Day, and I've been in practice ever since. Besides studying flower essences and essential oils and tuning forks in the next 5 years or so, I also started at the Barbara Brennan School of Healing. And not only did I graduate there, but I was a junior class teacher for 3 years. When I left the Brennan School in 1994, I believe it was, became aware of Capital University of Integrative Medicine, which was a 2-year postgraduate training for physicians. So I went through it. only to become the department chair of energy and spiritual healing. So I was teaching energy work to physicians. It was during that time frame that I first became aware of family constellations. I flew out to Seattle. I live in the Washington, D.C. area to take a workshop with Dietrich Klinghardt. And there, the last afternoon, he had 2 women come in and he turned it over to them for a demonstration on family constellations. And as I'm standing in the center of the circle, I'm welling up with tears. And at that point in the history of family constellations, you were not allowed to talk or move unless you were directed by the facilitator. So when they finally came up to me, she said, "And what do you want to do?" And I burst into tears and ran to my grandfather and jumped in his arms. And at that moment, I realized, boy, this is something I really need to study. And I think my whole life changed at that. As I walked back through the rows of my seat, I went from really feeling grief and overwhelming joy and all these emotions. As I got back to my seat, I was myself again. I said, I really need to study this. And that was how I embarked on family constellations.
Thanks for sharing that, Suzanne. You're referring to, of course, the powerful act there of representation, which is a key component of the family constellations healing modality, or philosophy, as Hellinger called it, whereby an individual represents for somebody else in the family field, and as such, the flow of emotions and the feelings and sensations and some of that person's experience may be moved through. I'm going to backtrack a little bit, if that's okay, Suzanne, back to the work with Barbara Brennan, just as a starting point, because we're interested in this fusion you've described of how you went from the individual energy healing field through to the family constellation or the systemic field. What was it attracted you initially to the Brennan School? We're fascinated to hear a little bit about your experience of learning through that model and program. Your skill set for working at different levels of the energy field. How did that develop under that school, etc.?
I was already doing energy work, and it turns out that one of the women I worked on said, "Oh, you've really got to study with this woman." Barbara was coming to the Washington, D.C. area, and I took that workshop, and the woman that was sponsoring her said to me, "I see you teaching with her." Oh, sure, yeah. Well, lo and behold, it was an instant match, because I was working on someone, and Barbara came up and said, what are you working on? So I'm working on his liver. She said, "Well, what's wrong with it?" I said, "Well, it's really pretty toxic." She says, "Well, what color is it?" I said, sort of a yellow-green. And she said, "You can see that?" And from that moment on, my vision shut down. I couldn't see a thing after that. I was scared silly. So then I knew I had to study with her in order to open up my vision again. I'm very, very grateful to Barbara Brennan. I think her book opened up my eyes. I really felt directed to be there. It wasn't easy energetically or emotionally, because it really pushed me through my stuff.
Regarding your visioning, right, and the development of your own sensory perception, I'm curious how that did unfold for you, the idea of it either coming back as vision, or in all that time of developing HSP, high sense perception, right, in the Brennan system. What did you clarify or learn about the way that you sense energy? And my connection to that is, how is it you see families at the level of the energy field to bridge to the constellation work? How do you see the family as a structure in a person's energy field, or however you might think of that? So
in terms of the high sense perception, I consider myself kinesthetic. When I was younger, I think I had very good vision as a child, and would mention it to my mother, and she said, "Oh, that isn't real. That's not, there's nothing there." And so I kind of shut that down for a while. until I started doing polarity therapy. When you open yourself up and then you see this world of vision, of everything that's there that is not physical. And so that's what I became aware, that there were layers of the field and spirit guides and that sort of thing. When I went to the Barbara Brennan School of Healing, Barbara said to me, "You're the most clairvoyant person I've ever met." And I said, "But I don't see." She says, "Yes, you do," because I would do it by feel. I trusted my sense perception. So I was able to tune in to you, even long distance, by sending out what Barbara called her scientific protoplasmic, extenders. I just call it energy. I touch you, I feel you, and then I pull back, And so I already had it before I went there, but I further developed it so that I could use it as a tool. It wasn't just something that showed up, I could call on it when I needed it.
The other part of the question, right? Like, what now, as you have developed and trusted that skill, and feel comfortable with it, feel clear with it, how is it that you're seeing this connect into working in the constellation paradigm?
I mean, I use colored mats on the floor and have somebody and say that this represents your mother, or the client's mother, and then have them stand on it. And literally the person's energy field is there. So you can feel, I think the reason that the family constellation works is that when someone comes to me in a group setting, their family's with them. You carry your family with you. They're behind you all the time. And when you make a statement of, I want to look at this in my family, the family is open to it, and that family system opens into the center of the field. So when someone steps on a representation of the client's mother, you get so much information. You can get the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, the injuries, the physical injuries. One of the men that I know was a representative in a minor representative in a constellation, and he kept going into this contortion with his body. And it turns out he was representing the brother of someone who had polio. And so he was physically representing that issue. And because he was a chiropractor, he said, my body went into a position that it's physically impossible to go into, We take on for a short period of time in service to the person that is presenting the constellation. So my sense perception is be able to go back and say, oh, this goes back 4 generations. It's like I can feel it, I can see it, I know it's that great grandmother that's the issue here. But I think that being open and aware is one of the most important things to really being able to do the family constellation work.
That's interesting, Susan. Just to clarify, I think what you're saying here, and please do correct me if I'm mistaken, but you're saying that in the act of representation, an individual, a physical individual who's with you as practitioner in the room or at a distance, when they take on a representation, they're directly connecting to the energy field of the individual they're representing.
Absolutely.
And as such, all the information that's available from that.
Absolutely. And it's almost as if they're stepping into that representation, that energy field of someone else. Okay. Now, I also teach it as a facilitator. You can stand next to a person who's representing and feel into the energy so that you know what that person is feeling as well. As you're representing, you can get a tremendous amount of information. And when I teach it, it's like only you utilize the information that comes through you for the purpose of what the constellation is looking for. You don't need to know that the person lived in a thatched roof house with a yellow door, and you can get a lot of information, but is it really pertinent to what the issue is in the moment?
I'm interested in what you're referring to here, maybe potentially tying it into the concept of energetic cords, connecting people in family systems or even intimate relationships or close relationships. How are they coming into play in the constellation work, as you say it?
The way that I look at it in family constellations is through what we call entanglements. You literally have an energy connection to someone else, almost to the point of taking on their energy, And so when you break the identification or the entanglement, what you're doing is lifting off this energy that belongs to someone else and giving it back to them.
If a person's going to get involved in healing work, they have to do their inner work. They have to do their self-work, right? And we sense ourselves initially as an individual. Constellation work is where we start looking at connections in the family field, right? And families are basically our most complex energetic relationships we have outside of our personal or individual selves. It's the family or the people that we grew up with in the immediate caretaking structure. Why do you think you're drawn to that? Or why do you think it's so important for people?
I think it's important because as I'm clearing my client's individual field of, let's just say, anger, I became aware of this anger didn't start with them. And so I started asking, which side of the family did the anger come down, the mother's side or the father's side? And usually the client knows immediately whether or not it's their actual parent, but they may be aware that it was grandpa was the angry one, And so we go down that individual energy field, and I would have all of them clear the pattern. So I would have the person clear it for themselves by saying it out loud, clearing the pattern, looking at their family system, and I give them a visual. Let's say it goes down the mother's line. So I have the mother, the parents, the grandparents, and have them visualize all of them mouthing whatever the statement is. So the person is not doing the work of the ancestors. They're doing their own work, but they're giving their ancestors the opportunity to clear it for themselves in this time frame, even though they're passed on and no longer in physical embodiment. But healing still takes place because of the continuity of energy and the timeline. So I see that if the anger started back here in the great-grandfather, that you can clear it and the person clears their anger and it doesn't come back to the same intensity. It's an easy, very fast way to shift energy, is to clear that emotional pattern. And if there's an emotional blockage that just won't clear, it's usually the only way to clear it.
I hear one of the things you're referencing there, Susan, is healing sentences as described by Hellinger. So statements that are spoken by the representative, or in this case, as you said, they could be seen mouthed by the ancestral line. Actually, could you describe it? How would you define a healing sentence, and how would you go about constructing one for a client? Because Keith and I have done this work, but I think it's much more helpful to have it mirrored back from you as a facilitator.
A lot of the healing sentences that I use in my constellation work and in the training that I teach are the actual words that Bert Hellinger said. I've tried it different ways. He has a way of narrowing it down to, he's a man of very few words, but the words that he used were very powerful. So if he came up with a healing sentence, it went right to the issue. Let me see if I can come up with one. Some of them for like breaking identifications are, I see you. I really see you. And when you really feel like the person is seeing them, the other person, that they're carrying their energy, then I have them say, and now I see you separate from me. Because when you're entangled, you don't see the person as a separate individual. You're literally entangled in their energy field. And so when you give that energy back to them, then you can see them as a separate individual. And at that point, they then become a resource and not an entanglement that you have to keep going in the same groove and never progressing forward. And it's a question of now I'm me and you're you. I'm free and you're free. I'm released and you're released. And usually it's at that point it's clear.
Thank you, Susan. So for people who haven't experienced the kind of work before, what accompanies these phrases or these healing statements is quite a lot of feeling and emotion as well, right? So it's the statements, like you said earlier, the statements are a way of actually giving form to the energy to actually create a movement that then has to also potentially be felt as an emotional movement or a felt sense of shift within the person at other levels than just verbal. And so that's the mechanism of the speaking, is really to enact a deeper movement on an energetic or an emotional, even let's say a psychological level. So this character, Bert Hellinger, as you're describing, the founder of this, it seems like quite a looming figure. You know, people like many great teachers, they leave this legacy where people just talk about them a lot and marvel at the story. So I'm wondering, what was it like? I mean, did you get a chance to study with him directly? And if so, any memorable like story or experience you'd want to share that illustrates the kind of teacher or facilitator or person he was?
Bert was, as I said, a man of few words, but he was also a warrior. And he would just state something, even if he knew it would be difficult to hear, you know. And I've seen him in workshops where he'd state something and the shock wave went through the whole group, you know, like, oh God, you know, everybody'd hold their breath and you'd have to encourage them to breathe. And, you know, at one point in a workshop, Bert tried to get someone to bow to his mother or father. I think it was his father, and he refused. And Bert went around his back and he hit him on the back of his heart chakra to shock the energy, you know. And unfortunately, it was misconstrued by the people who were not energetically oriented. And it was talked about for probably till this day, you know, of how Bert had hit this person, you know, and it's just not done in therapy. So a year and a half later, I was down in Oaxaca, Mexico, and saw this man that Bert had shocked the back of his heart chakra. And he said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. It was such a great intervention that it shifted his whole life. So, you know, there are different things that you hear about in different interventions from different perspectives. But seeing it from an energetic point of view, it was marvelous.
What is it that you personally, Susan, take away from having connected directly with Bert as an individual or as a practitioner?
Oh, when I was at the Barbara Brennan School of Healing in the late 80s, early 90s, the philosophy was the toxic parent. And you stayed away from your toxic parent. You avoided them at all costs. You know, they were terrible, et cetera, et cetera. What I learned from Bert Hellinger was, you open your heart and you honor your parents. He doesn't, and he says the 10 Commandments say, honor thy mother and thy father. It doesn't say you have to love them. It doesn't say you have to like them, but you honor them. And as Bert says, for giving you life. So I was able to turn towards my mother and honor her for giving me life, which then opened up all of the energy to my maternal ancestors that flowed through me. And that was the biggest thing that I came away with Bert.
Right. And this is describing something that he refers to, I believe he refers to as the symmetry of love or orders of love, the idea that there's in a sense, a flow of energy, whose fountainhead would be this quality of love we're speaking of, and that when we don't honor or open ourselves to our maternal or paternal line, those two people who came together and did give us life, we're actually disrupting that flow of life, disrupting the ability for ourselves to receive and be abundant and actually be in the flow of life rather than somehow being antagonistic towards it.
Absolutely. So when someone comes to me and is bad mouthing their mother, my mother this or my mother that, the first question I have is, so in this workshop, what if I was to tell you I was going to connect you with your mother? No. And from then on, I know whether or not the constellation is going to work. It's really all about love.
I have one question, a curious question that circles around this and brings things back even to the vastness of the kind of studying and training you've done. How is it that you're finding when you target where there is a merged identity or an entangled identity? What about this idea that people's identity is somehow merged with what might be called a transpersonal self? Sometimes you might hear the term past life, literal, metaphorical, doesn't matter. But point being, what about those identities? Do you ever bump into those in family constellation work, or how do you deal with that phenomena if it arises?
I did a lot of past life healing work when I was a student at the Brennan School and thereafter. When I became aware of the constellation work, I sort of put that on hold and only went down the genetic line. And it's only been recently that they've been seeping in, and so I have to ask, is this a current life issue? Is this an ancestral issue? Is this a past life issue? And then you can do the constellation on the past life. It's something I don't talk about a lot because I want to keep it as pure as possible, the family constellation work, but it's rearing its head, and when it does, you've got to look at it.
Are there any limitations that you would see to these modalities? Is there anything that, can't be done? Or is there something that stands out to you as being a healthy expectation of a limitation?
I think the limitation is time. I think you can heal anything given enough time. But a lot of times people will come to you as the last resort of they've gone to every doctor, every physician, every other healer, and they show up on my door. And, if you'd come to me 6 months ago or 2 years ago, maybe the energy work would have had time to fully clear out the enormity of the energy block that's there, basically the emotions. But I just see time as the limitation.
You've clearly achieved much in your professional life thus far. The body of wisdom you've developed and shared with so many others and through the Hellinger Institute DC. Is there anything upcoming? Is there any stones unturned, as it were? We tend to check in with our guests at this point and just look to their future aspirations, if there are any.
Oh, well, yesterday was my birthday, and I had an absolutely amazing exchange with an acupuncture friend of mine that opened me up so much further in the universe that I'm not even sure yet where it's going to go. I'm waiting for everything to fall into place, and then I'll know. So I'm really I'm open to whatever happens.
How might, as we kind of come to a close here in this talk, how might people find you and your work, and what's currently your activity in terms of the services you're providing?
I have one website that's called hellingerdc.com, HELLINGERDC.com. I list all of the workshops and the trainings that are there. So we do the constellations in workshops, we teach it in a facilitator training, and we have the online store for the DVDs that are available, and the majority of the books that are published in English. I do individual constellations, individual sessions, In the near future, I will be doing a workshop on clearing emotional patterns transgenerationally, which I've done in the past and was very well attended during the pandemic because people's emotions were up big time. So I'll plan on starting that again. But that's what I have on the horizon at this moment in time.
Wonderful. So I'd just like to reference that website one last time for you. That's the hellingerdc.com. And Keith and I would both like to thank you, of course, for your time, Susan, for being here with us today and sharing a little bit of your story.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me, and keep up the good work, the two of you.
Thanks for listening. You can find us at fielddynamicshealing.com.